It's only morning here. I understand you are quite a bit ahead of me. This is an unusual experience, and I first want to thank Anil and the other organizers of this webinar for inviting me to talk. This is quite an honor. And of course, it's always a pleasure to talk about the research that we've been doing, especially when it has been somewhat successful, which I think this project has turned out to be. As was mentioned, Anil spent some time in my laboratory several years ago working on a related project with metal sulfides, but I will not have time to talk about that in this lecture. So I think I can share screen. And are we good to go? Can you tell me if it looks like everybody is able to see the screen at this point?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, thank you. So I will begin. So the talk is going to be on using single source precursors to advanced materials. And this project is actually one that began in the early 2000s when we had an idea as a graduate student could be applied to material science. And that was looking at metal carbonyl clusters as precursors to advanced materials. So I should point out first the people here on the slide, Anna, Adam, Desmond, Andrew, and Jing Han, all contributed to this project over a period of about 15 years. So it took us a while to actually get to the point where we understood the system well enough to make some progress. And at the time that Anna began years ago, the expertise in organometallic chemistry in my lab had dwindled and she had to recreate knowledge from scratch. So she was a pioneer, and then this project was taken over by Adam as a graduate when Desmond was working on the project that we were able to add two postdocs, Andrew and Xinghan, to this effort. So what is the issue? So the challenge is, to put it quite simply, how do you create phase pure materials when there are multiple possible stoichiometries and or phases possible? And to give you an example of that, I'm going to put up the iron system. And so you can see from this table that there are at least 6 known iron phosphide phases with a wide range of stoichiometries. And so that poses a challenge, even by conventional solid state methods, of how you target and make one of these particular phases in a pure form. It's a very interesting materials. They have quite different properties. They have varying conductivity properties and so on. So being able to target one or more of these specifically is important. Now, when we began, we were primarily interested initially in making nanoparticles. And the only 2 nanoparticle phases that had been made at that time were FEP and Fe2P, and it was difficult to control which of those phases you got. The one we decided to look for first was, as you will see shortly, there were some possible precursors that looked promising for making this particular phase. One other thing I'd point out about these phosphide materials is that across the first row of the periodic table, there are many similarities between, say, for example, manganese, iron, chromium, nickel, cobalt. They adopt very similar crystal structures, but of course the electronics of those materials are quite different. So they pose some interesting possibilities for studying the system with different metals, but also for studying the system with different combinations of the metals, so not just homometallic species. but also heterometallic species. And as you can see here at the bottom, one of the things we thought would be really cool is if we could make this particular material, which incorporated iron, manganese, phosphorus, and arsenic all in the same material. This is a big challenge to make a single source precursor that would actually accommodate all of these materials in some reasonable stoichiometry. Was like a holy grail for us, that we thought this would be a really a good challenge for. Okay, so that's where we started. The idea was to be able to take some sort of molecules and make a selective phase from this system. Here are the molecules we chose to look at. So these are metal carbonyl clusters. On these pictures, I've been generic. I have not labeled the types of atoms because for most of the first row transition series, you can substitute one metal atom for another type and have the same type of structure. So the metal carbonyls are here. The metal atoms are in red. The main group atoms, and I'm again not specifying only phosphorus, but you could have pretty much a wide variety of other main group element species present here. You can have organic functions on the main group fragment, but these main group fragments could also be what we call naked. They could be just an atom attached to the metal cluster. But as you can see, there are a wide variety of structures and stoichiometries that have a range of combinations of number of main group atoms to number of transition metals. And so our idea is, or was at that time, that we could build molecules that would give us a single precursor that would have the stoichiometry that we would like to have in our final material. Single source precursors are not new. Oh, this is something strange has happened here. I'm sorry, I thought I got this fixed. They're not new. They've been known for a very long time, for decades, in fact. And you could, this technology was used for making pure nickel. So if you're familiar with nickel carbonyl, it's a volatile material that will decompose on heating to nickel metal, and it gives very pure nickel metal. Heterometallic compounds have been prepared from heterometallic metal carbonyl, so that is not particularly new. But it's not been previously applied to more complex phase systems which incorporate main group elements or heteroatoms. So where we began was to look at this particular molecule, which has 3 irons and 1 phosphorus. And this was our target molecule for making the phase Fe3P. This was a known compound in the literature. You make it quite simply by taking tri-iron dodecacarbonyl, treating it with primary phosphine, and you could use a wide variety of R groups on the phosphorus here. And it gives you this tetranuclear cluster. I include the phosphorus in that. It's tetrahedral. A triangle of iron atoms with a phosphorus T-butyl group stuck on top. And there are 2 hydrides attached to the metal framework. So as I said earlier, our initial goal was to make nanoparticles. So we began doing that, and we chose a conventional way of doing that, which is to do this in a high boiling surfactant solvent system. That method involved taking trioctylamine in a mixture with oleic acid and decomposing it just by heating it up. Unfortunately, when we did this, we got Fe2P. Now, so this is a nice single source precursor in a sense. You can make Fe2P. You make Fe2P very cleanly. And what you get are nice nanorods. And these can be single nanorods. They can be bundled nanorods. But the problem was that it wasn't Fe3P. And we spent a number of years trying to figure out exactly what was going on. And then we realized that oleic acid is not innocent in making nanoparticles. that it leaches metal out of the material, and so you don't get as much iron in the final product as you would like. The difficulty is, excuse me, if you take out the oleic acid, you don't get very nice nanoparticles. And so we confirmed that if you added oleic acid to Fe3P, that it would convert to Fe2P. And if you kept going, that Fe2P would be converted by oleic acid to FeP. And you could keep going, and the FeP would convert to iron oxide nanoparticles. And that is expected because if you have oleic acid and you react it with these metal phosphides, that ultimately what you're making is an iron carboxylate, and iron carboxylates are known under different circumstances to decompose to iron oxide nanoparticles. So this all made a lot of sense, but it was disappointing to us because we didn't get the right stoichiometry of the material that we wanted. About the same time, we were also looking at heterometallic species, and we made a single source precursor that contained both iron and manganese. The target phase here was FEMNP, and as you see from this molecule, we have the right stoichiometry. We have one iron, we have a manganese, we have one phosphorus. We spent some time developing the synthesis of this because we needed a molecule that did not have organic groups here at the top. We had started out with literature compounds having phenyl groups in these places or having a phenyl group and a hydrogen, but those were not successful precursors. So Adam Colson developed a synthesis for making the mu-PH2. That material worked very well for making nanoparticles. You could make nanorods again. They are isostructural to Fe2P. They give nice nanorods, but we also found a similar problem here to what we found with the iron system, and that was that if you actually look at the composition of those nanoparticles, they are not exactly stoichiometric. There is an excess of iron compared to manganese in these compounds. And the bottom line of this is that it is the oleic acid, that oleic acid will preferentially leach manganese out of these nanoparticles instead of iron. They're always manganese deficient. And that is because, as you might expect from looking at the periodic table, that manganese is more oxophilic than iron, and it likes to be bound to these oxo-carboxylate ligands. But one of the things we did discover was that we could heat the material in the solid state, and it would decompose in the solid state, and it would give you exactly FEMNP, the precise stoichiometry. Here is a powder X-ray diffraction of the material that was produced. You can see our nanoparticles were rich in iron. They are the black curve here. The nanoparticles are very small, so it's a bit noisy for the background here. But you can see for the bulk material, bulk decomposition in the solid state, you get nice one-to-one stoichiometry. So we decided that we were going to be in some way cowardly, but in some ways very clever, and that was to make these materials not using oleic acid, and in fact not using solvent at all. So we turned from looking at nanoparticles to looking at MOCVD, metal organic chemical vapor deposition. And we developed a very simple and crude apparatus where we have our precursor loaded into a glass tube. There is a metal stage that has some substrates attached to it, and those can be a wide variety of substrates, as it turns out. We started using glass slides, silicon dioxide glass slides, and it turns out we can use a wide variety of things. Silicon dioxide itself presents some problems we'll talk about later. So the metal stage, we do something very simple. We put this on a high vacuum line. We evacuate the system. We heat this zone up to about, well, 350 to 400 degrees centigrade. There is enough heat when we heat here to volatilize the precursors that we are using. They will sublime. And when they sublime, they hit this hot stage and they decompose and form nice films on the substrates that we're using. You can take X-ray diffraction patterns of these films. They are a perfect match in this case for Fe3P. And you can also look at the composition by XPS, where you do a sputtering experiment. It's called depth profiling, where what we do is we start at the surface and we examine the material. So this is the iron composition up here. This is the phosphorus composition, roughly 3:1. It's not exact because there are some differences in the way the elements sputter, but this is what you would expect for Fe3P. You sputter and you take an XPS analysis again, and then you work your way through the film. And after about 45 minutes, when we get past this point, we have gone all the way down to the glass slide, and what you see is only silicon up here at 60 minutes. So the films are phase pure throughout the film. It works very nicely. And then if you measure the magnetic properties of those films, they are paramagnetic. They show exactly the magnetic moment that you would expect from Fe3P. This was done in collaboration with members of our physics department, Professor Emilia Moroshin and her group. And so it was very gratifying that we could make Fe3P as phase pure films that had the same properties as bulk material. Now, one of the things that we can do with the method that we're using is create doped materials. And we are going to use, to do that, the isolobal analogy developed by Roald Hoffmann that won him a Nobel Prize. And the idea is that this cluster is our precursor, it's volatile, but we can make other metal carbonyl clusters, which is the beauty of this system, that are isostructural. So another compound known in the literature was cobalt-3 CO9 PT-butyl. It is also volatile. And so what you can do is simply mix these two materials together, and we would do that by dissolving them in solution and evaporating off the solvent to get a very intimately mixed system of iron and cobalt. And then we could deposit our thin films, and the thin films show doping by cobalt. They show what you would expect for the X-ray parameters as a linear function of the increase in cobalt composition and the magnetic properties of the materials as affected by the new transition metal. We could also go the other way and dope these materials with a main group element. So instead of changing out the iron, we could change out the phosphorus. So here we did the same thing, but we used an isolobal compound containing tellurium, and we got similar results where we could vary the amount of tellurium doped into the materials, and it fit very consistently with the magnetic properties and also the X-ray diffraction patterns for those. Well, having been successful now in making Fe3P and FEMNP as thin films, what we wanted to do was to, oh wait, I haven't told you about FEMNP yet, sorry, is to make these doped materials of Fe3P. We decided it would be very nice to make the other members of this series. So we haven't made all the members of the iron series, but we wanted to make phase pure FeP and Fe2P in addition to Fe3P. We started using this particular precursor, FeCO4, with phosphine on it. Unfortunately, when you decompose this material, we initially got a mixture of both FeP and Fe2P. We ultimately found out that part of the reason for that is that this phosphine is not attached very strongly to the iron. And so when you are heating, you get some loss of the phosphine. And that allows an iron carbonyl fragment to react with precursor, or that's what we believe, because this can happen very cleanly if you do this at the right temperature so that you allow that reorganization to take place. You can use this precursor to get pure Fe2P. If you put a T-butyl group on the phosphorus, it sticks more strongly to the iron, and this compound will act as a precursor to pure FeP. So that one will give you pure FeP. We also synthesized this particular molecule, which acts as a precursor to FeP. I'm not going to go into the synthesis of this. It's quite interesting. It's an interesting molecule in itself because each of these phosphorus atoms is chiral. And so it gives very interesting NMR spectra and X-ray, single crystal X-ray diffraction results. But we'll have to save that for another time. So anyway, we could, having gone through this study now, make FeP in pure form. We could make Fe2P in pure form. We could make a mixture, which was not that interesting, but at that time, and then we could make pure Fe3P. And we'll talk a little bit more about using that a little bit later. The next thing we'll show you are the pictures of those. These are electron micrographs of the films. You can see that they're quite different. The FeP is here, Fe2P and Fe3P. They have very different crystal structures and morphologies of the materials once you have them deposited. We could also do the same thing with FEMNP. I jumped the gun a couple of minutes ago. We could make phase pure materials of FEMNP using our precursor. But we had some initial problems. It took us a little while to sort this out because when we've made these the same way that we made the Fe3P, we found that our films were always contaminated with some manganese oxide and some FeP. And similar to the circumstance with oleic acid, what we found was that the glass slides were not innocent, that these materials would actually react with the glass to oxidize the manganese, and that would leave us with some 1-to-1 iron phosphide. This was actually something, we went back to the literature and looked and actually found out that this was precedented. If you start out with just manganese carbonyl and deposit it on glass slides, then you get manganese oxide. You do not get manganese metal being deposited on the slides. So that was problematic. Again, this took us 4 or 5 years to sort out as we went through checking out all sorts of problems with our apparatus before we hit on the idea that we just needed to change the material on which it was deposited. And then you could do that. You could make phase pure FEMNP films, and you could put it on a wide variety of substrates. So these were grown on alumina, Al2O3, and you get nice pure films on alumina because it is less able to undergo reduction by the metal phosphide film. Interestingly, this is the metastable phase of FEMNP. FEMNP, if you go back to the original not a hexagonal, but an orthorhombic phase. And so when you are growing this, what we are getting, we believe, is kinetic control of the film growth, where the iron and manganese sites are statistically distributed throughout the crystal lattice. Okay, so there are advantages to using these, and the lessons that we learned was that the phosphine ligands are volatile and they can serve as leaving groups. So we have to play around with the chemistry to make sure that doesn't happen. And we can do that by modifying the ligand donor properties. We can change the R groups. Of course, you want R groups that are going to be good leaving groups because you do not want carbon left in your films, but that is a problem we can solve. T-butyl is actually a very good leaving group. And then bridging phosphide ligands, such as the mu-PH2 ligand, are really good at leaving, at serving as phosphines in these cases. And then the decomposition temperature is also important because that can control the kinetics of the process and determine the ultimate product that you end up with. Okay, so now what we want to do is look at water splitting catalysis. And again, I have this crazy thing going on with these slides showing up slowly. I'm not sure what happened there. So we have two parts of the water splitting reaction. It's a redox process. You have the hydrogen evolution part of the reaction, where what we are going to do is reduce the water to produce hydrogen. And then we are going to have the oxygen evolution reaction, which then is oxidizing the oxygen in the water to give us oxygen gas. And so we have these two processes going on. When we examine these materials, we actually look at water splitting for both processes, and we can look at that individually. We do these in electrochemical cells. So these are electrocatalytic reactions. But these metal phosphides will catalyze the water splitting reaction. And we have examined, in this particular study, we examined FEP, Fe2P, and Fe3P and compared them to platinum. They are actually very good materials. These are earth abundant materials, of course. They're much less expensive than platinum, but they compare very favorably in their function. And one of the bottom lines of this is that Fe3P is best, that you actually have a dependence on which of the metal phosphides you use. Theoretically, by collaborators we have at the University of Houston, who examined the adsorption of hydrogen to the surfaces of these particular materials from a variety of different surfaces that you could look at. And what happens, and we think this is important here, is this particular face of this particular phase for Fe3P is that the hydrogen will bind to 3 iron atoms. So it actually adopts not just a doubly bridging site, as you might see here, or as a terminal site, which you can see here, but it actually will associate itself with 3 irons. And that gives a thermoneutral ability for the hydrogen to associate and dissociate from the surface, which is what you need for good catalytic activity to produce hydrogen in these systems. We also examined FEMNP, and FEMNP turns out also to be a very good catalytic reaction, but we are looking at now the OER reaction. We'll start with the OER, the oxygen evolution reaction, and it works very well. It's a nice stable phase. Now, there is, I guess, a disclaimer here, is that we don't actually think when we run the oxidation reaction that we are keeping FEMNP as FEMNP. We believe that there's oxidation taking place on the surface of the catalyst, but the catalysts are very good and they're very stable, and we still see FEMNP on the surface of these electrodes. This is on fluorine-doped tin oxide. And so what we think is happening here is the FEMNP is a conductive material, and it forms a nice interface with the FTO. And then a very small layer of metal oxide is forming on the surface of the FEMNP to give us a highly active oxygen evolution catalyst for this particular part of the process. So we can put the FEMNP on fluorine-doped tin oxide. You've seen we put it on alumina previously. We can also put it on titanium oxide nanorod arrays. So the MOCVD reaction allows you to easily deposit this material onto patterned surfaces as well. We have very good characterization of those materials. As you see, we have the titanium and oxygen, as you would expect, iron, manganese, and phosphorus on the surface. Of course, it's heavier here towards the ends of the nanorods, but it covers very well, and you can a precursor that you use to deposit onto this nanorod array. The cool thing about using titanium dioxide here, and we're just going to focus on one aspect of this for the OER reaction, is that, of course, you know titanium dioxide is a semiconductor, and you can use it to photosensitize these materials. So what you can do is you deposit your FEMNP film on the titanium dioxide, you use it as an electrode, you irradiate this film with a lamp from the bottom of this cell where you're looking at irradiating the titanium dioxide side, and then you get an increased, a tremendous enhancement in the catalytic activity while this is being irradiated. So you get a photoelectrochemical enhancement of the OER reaction by depositing this FEMNP film on titanium dioxide. And the FEMNP and the FTO, the titanium dioxide, are ideally set up for carrying out this process to produce the oxygen from water splitting, and you can see the energetics. The energetic levels are favorable for allowing the hole and electron separation in this particular material. But FEMNP on nickel foam on metal, now just a metal electrode, will catalyze both the HER and the OER reactions. So this is FEMNP deposited on nickel foam. It forms very nice material. Now this is a nickel foam that has also been treated with graphene. So you can coat the nickel foam with some graphene and then deposit the FEMNP film on that. You get, again, the same material. The FEMNP is the hexagonal FEMNP. This works very nicely for producing a new type of composite electrode material. And when you carry out these reactions, you get very good response for both the FEMNP on nickel foam and on the FEMNP on the graphite-coated nickel foam materials. And so there's quite a bit of possibility here for using these types of materials and using this methodology to create different types of electrodes for doing the water splitting process. The nice thing is that you can do both of these processes now, the HER reaction and the OER reaction, with essentially the same electrode material, which is an advantage. Okay, just so in summary, what we've seen is that these things have very good responses. They have fairly low overpotentials compared to some of the other non-noble metal catalysts. And they do both, in this case for FEMNP, they do both the OER and the HER reaction. The catalysts show good stability over time. You can run these for very long catalytic runs, and they do not show degradation. So that is also encouraging. Similar to the iron 3P material, the hydrogens look to be associating with 3 metal atoms in this process, and that also is what you need to see for this catalytic reaction. Turn to sort of our bragging as organometallic chemists. If you remember early on, I said we wanted to ultimately be able to make precursors that had not only iron, manganese, and phosphorus, but iron, manganese, phosphorus, and arsenic in order to make FEMNPAS. And Desmond was able to do that. So one of the targets for this, for FEMNPAS, is you want 2 transition metals per main group element, but you want both arsenic and phosphorus. You want both iron and manganese, because this particular material has a giant magnetocaloric effect, which means that you could use this potentially to generate electricity. Or you could use it in an opposite sense as a electrical cooling device. In fact, these are being used in Switzerland. They are using the FEMNPAS material to do energy generation in some trial plants in Switzerland. So here were our attempts that we were successful in actually making these new organometallic complexes. We were able to take our starting materials, some compounds. I'm not going to tell you this about the synthesis right now, but we have some materials that have 3 irons and an arsenic that we could react with manganese and also with our T-butyl phosphine ligand and make a T-butyl phosphine 3 iron 1 manganese metal carbonyl compound. We could also convert that to a bridge and arsenic and phosphorus ratios, but in this case the phosphine is a terminal phosphine, and in this case it's a bridging phosphine where that hydrogen has been added across the metal-metal bond of the iron to give us this bridge species. When we initially look at this, whoops, excuse me, I clicked on the wrong thing. When we initially looked at this, we have done some preliminary studies. These will volatilize, they will deposit films. They have the right composition. They show FEMNPAS as the composition of the film. It has an appropriate X-ray diffraction pattern for that material. And so we're confident that we could use this to make thin films of this material, but we have not yet studied the properties. Okay, so in summary, I just want to reiterate what we've said, that these metal carbonyl complexes have quite a bit of flexibility in being able to design them with stoichiometries that match a particular transition metal main group element phase. That so far these things have not been made by other methods in phase pure form. That these decompose under relatively mild conditions. If you look at the temperatures we are using, these metal carbonyls decompose around 350 to 400 degrees centigrade. If you make these materials by solid state methods, you have to heat them up to about 1,000 degrees centigrade, or over, in fact. They are a little bit tricky because the main group elements tend to be volatile. So you may have to repeat those solid state syntheses multiple times to get the exact stoichiometry. So we're getting these things very conveniently in very pure form at a substantially lower temperature than the conventional methods. They can be used to deposit these materials on a wide variety of substrates. We don't have any limitations except perhaps whether the substrate interacts with the material or not. The substrates may not be innocent, so we do have to pay some attention. But that is certainly an obstacle that we can overcome. We can make different metal phosphide phases selectively, so we're not getting cross-contamination. There are certainly opportunities for making other precursors that go in the other direction. So for making an FEP2 and an FEP4 phase, we have in process studies for making precursors that would do that. We also have some precursors that could end up giving us Fe4P, which we have not examined at this point either. But the point is that the opportunities are fairly wide open. We can make doped compounds or isostructural components for creating heterometallic species. And that also gives us additional range for this particular methodology. And of course, the final thing is that the iron phosphides are good water splitting catalysts for both the hydrogen evolution and the oxygen evolution reactions. And there we found that the activity increases with increasing metal content. So anyway, that concludes my presentation. I want to thank you for coming and hearing this talk and allowing me to present some of our results. This has been very much fun for me, especially during the pandemic when I have been stuck working at home for the past 6 months. So it is nice to actually talk to people about science. So with that, I will conclude, and I think that we might have time for some questions. I will leave that up to the organizers now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable, informative and wonderful session, sir. And thank you for sharing the challenges that you faced while synthesizing these materials. You have also shared your success story and the efforts towards designing the molecule to serve as single source precursors for advanced solid materials. Thank you so much for giving your valuable time to us, sir. And of course, we will be dealing with few questions from the participants and they are eager to ask them. So I hand over to Dr. Palve, sir, for the questions from the participants. Yes, sir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Lina ma'am. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Kenton Whitmire, for delivering a wonderful presentation and a brilliant talk. Few participants have a question. The first question is, what are the advantage of the single source precursors as compared to multiple source precursors?
So that's a good question. It's actually a matter, if you think about it, of statistics. So if you have multiple source precursors, and people do deposit films or even make nanoparticles out of multiple source precursors. If you are making a material such as cadmium sulfide or cadmium selenide, it's not even a challenge because you are only going to get cadmium sulfide or cadmium selenide. There's only one phase that is possible, although there are two structural forms of that phase, but still you're only going to get one stoichiometry. You're only going to get cadmium 1-to-1 to sulfur or selenium. So if you want to make much more difficult. And you can imagine the kinetics and the thermodynamics of that process. What do you have to do? You have to have separate precursors. They each have their own kinetics of decomposition. You have to tune those so that you provide each of those materials at exactly the right rate to get whatever stoichiometry you want. You have to be able to deliver those to a surface very selectively if you want to make a thin film. And so the kinetics are against you. You know, you have a lot more tailoring to do to decompose a material. If all of the elements are in the same compound, and that compound decomposes, those elements are hopefully all still there. But if you are using multiple precursors, then you can't guarantee that. And so I actually heard from Adam Coulson after he took a job for a while. He was at Dow Chemical, and he said, you know, we have been developing this and talking about it for some time, in giving talks about the work at a much earlier stage when Adam was working on it. And Adam said he never felt appreciated until he went to Dow and he dealt with the engineers, because the engineers said that this particular problem of trying to do co-decomposition of multiple precursors was terribly difficult. And the engineers had a much higher respect for what we were doing than the chemists did. And so I felt a little bit gratified in the approach that we had taken.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's the beauty of single source precursor.
Yes.
Yeah, so I will move to a second question. Second question is related to FEMNP. One participant asked that how much FEMNP is close to platinum catalyst for water splitting?
Well, I would say it's not, I mean, it's not platinum, but it gets much closer. I think the overpotentials are a little bit higher, but we're down around, I think if I remember, 57 millielectron volts for the overpotential for FEMNP, which is not shabby because most of the other compounds that have been used are up over 100, right? 100, 150, 160. So we're not at platinum, but we are much closer to platinum than you have for the other earth abundant metal phosphide catalysts that have been studied.
Yeah. The third and the last question is, what are the minimum requirement to meet the challenge to go close towards the platinum catalyst?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that we are just at the beginning of understanding that. And that's part of the reason we were looking at doping, because I think there is some evidence in the literature that heterometallic systems actually work better than the homometallic systems. That's one of the reasons we wanted to look at FEMNP. But there is a whole range of bimetallic first row transition metal phosphide complexes that could be made and examined by this methodology. So I think that now, you know, what we would need is a really good theoretician to help us examine that, because, you know, the phase space that you have is very large. There are a tremendously large number of combinations of transition metals and phosphorus that you could try. It would be nice to have a theoretician who could look at that and systematically do in the computer doping experiments and figure out what might be the most profitable avenues of research. But again, you can also do some of that experimentally in making the doped materials and doing a survey of the catalytic activities. And, you know, you can base that on what's in the literature now for the promising phases for metal phosphides, because there's lots of work going on metal phosphide catalysis. But of course, the metal sulfides are also good. And we have the possibility of combining phosphides with sulfides. We don't know exactly what the effects would be there. So I think there's a lot of room for future progress in this particular area.